In this video, we dive deep into how Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine has reshaped Russia's geopolitical standing, exposing the cracks in his leadership and the devastating consequences of his decisions. From trusting corrupt institutions to overestimating his military strength, Putin's miscalculations have left Russia weakened, isolated, and economically crippled. Stay tuned as we explore the critical mistakes that have not only tarnished Putin's legacy, but also left the world questioning his once unshakable grip on power. Vladimir Putin's decisions leading to the war in Ukraine have reshaped Russia's image and geopolitical standing in ways that even the Kremlin's strongest propaganda machine can't repair. Today we find ourselves asking the most pressing question: how did one of the most calculating leaders in modern history make such a disastrous miscalculation? How could he, a leader who seemed to play geopolitical chess while others were stuck in checkers, misread the board so entirely? To fully grasp the magnitude of Putin's errors, we need to look at the core of his leadership style, the deeply flawed systems that surrounded him, and his own overconfidence that propelled him into an unwinnable war. In a way, the unraveling of Putin's carefully constructed image was inevitable, driven by his desire to restore a version of Russia that exists only in the imagination of Soviet-era nostalgists. What we're seeing today is the fallout of three critical mistakes: his blind trust in corrupted institutions, his misplaced faith in his military generals, and his hubris-driven ambition that led him to overestimate his ability to outsmart the West and secure Russia's dominance in Ukraine. Let's start with Putin's first and most glaring mistake: his unfounded trust in Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB. For someone who once served in the Soviet KGB, you'd think Putin would have a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to intelligence reports. But the reality is, Putin cultivated an FSB that told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear. This is the curse of autocratic rule. The higher you climb the power ladder, the more the truth gets filtered by those who fear you. For Putin, the FSB's reports were more than just bad intelligence. They were a deadly combination of optimism and delusion, tailor-made to reinforce his worldview. The FSB's two primary tasks before the invasion were to assess the West's likely response to a Russian offensive and gauge how Ukraine would react. In both areas, the FSB failed spectacularly. Their assessment of the West was laughably out of touch. They believed that just like in 2008 during the invasion of Georgia, or in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, the West would stay on the sidelines. The FSB and Putin misjudged the post-Cold War era as one where Western powers were more concerned with economic stability than standing up to aggression. Sure, the West had hit Russia with sanctions in the past, but these were largely symbolic, leaving Putin free to flex his military muscles. What the FSB missed was a critical shift in the West's perspective. After years of watching Putin undermine democratic institutions, meddle in elections and back authoritarian regimes, Western policymakers were waking up to the idea that Russia under Putin was not going to stop. As a result, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine in February 2022, they were met with a united Western front that Putin never anticipated. The West slapped Russia with unprecedented economic sanctions, froze billions in Russian assets, and began supplying Ukraine with humanitarian, financial, and military aid on a scale unimaginable just a few years earlier. Yet the FSB's biggest failure wasn't in reading the West, but in misjudging Ukraine itself. They fed Putin the idea that Ukraine was a country on the verge of collapse, that Russian soldiers would be welcomed as liberators. Putin believed that Ukraine was still the fractured, corrupt state that Russia had easily manipulated in 2014. But Ukraine in 2022 was a different nation. It had undergone 8 years of transformation, bolstered by a growing sense of national identity and a fierce desire for independence. The FSB never saw it coming. They never anticipated the fierce resistance, the unity of the Ukrainian people, and their willingness to fight Russia to the bitter end. Putin's second grave mistake was trusting his military generals, who fed him the same kind of delusions as the FSB. Putin believed in the strength of the Russian military because, on paper, it was one of the strongest in the world. He had spent years showcasing Russia's military might through grand parades and public demonstrations of military exercises. However, as the war in Ukraine dragged on, it became clear that the Russian military was nowhere near as formidable as Putin had been led to believe. On the surface, Russia's military numbers were staggering. In 2021, Russia spent over $45 billion on defense, while Ukraine's budget was just a fraction of that. Russia had far more armored vehicles, aircraft, and personnel. It seemed like a sure victory. But there's one thing Putin's generals didn't account for. Numbers alone don't win wars. And when it came to morale, Ukraine had an advantage that Russia could never overcome. Ukraine wasn't just fighting for land or politics, it was fighting for its very existence. As the war unfolded, it became evident that Putin's military wasn't the second strongest in the world. It wasn't even the strongest in Ukraine. The mighty Russian army struggled to gain ground, bogged down by logistical failures, low morale, and outdated tactics. In the first 6 months alone, Russia lost nearly half of its professional military, including some of its most elite soldiers and advanced equipment. What was supposed to be a swift victory turned into a drawn-out quagmire that has bled the Russian military dry. Putin's faith in his generals was misplaced because, like the FSB, they told him what he wanted to hear. They assured him that Ukraine would fold within days, that Kiev would fall, and that the world would simply watch. The generals, keen to keep their positions in Putin's regime, never gave him a realistic picture of the situation on the ground. They didn't tell him that Ukraine's military had been quietly modernizing since 2014, that Ukrainian soldiers were more than willing to fight to the death, or that Russia's own military was unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. Perhaps the most significant of Putin's mistakes, however, was his overconfidence, his belief that he could rewrite history, defy the West, and restore Russia's greatness. This is where Putin's personal ambitions and his deep-seated sense of Russian exceptionalism come into play. Putin has always seen himself as the leader who would restore Russia's glory, reversing the collapse of the Soviet Union and reclaiming the lands that he believes rightfully belong to Russia. Ukraine, in his eyes, was never truly a separate nation, but rather a wayward territory that needed to be brought back into the fold. This belief, though, was not just misguided, it was catastrophic. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was not based on rational calculations or strategic interests. It was rooted in a deeply emotional and personal desire to secure his legacy as the man who made Russia great again. This is why he overreached. He believed that the world would bend to his will because, for years, it had. From Georgia to Crimea, Putin had flexed his muscles, and the West had largely stood by. He had meddled in foreign elections, propped up dictators, and violated international law with little more than a slap on the wrist. But in 2022, the world changed. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was not just an attack on a neighboring country. It was an attack on the post-World War II order, a challenge to the idea that borders should remain intact and that nations have the right to self-determination. And for the first time, the West responded with force. Putin's overconfidence wasn't just a strategic miscalculation, it was the product of years of isolation, both physically and ideologically. Surrounded by yes men and cut off from reality, Putin had come to believe in his own infallibility. He had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that his position as Russia's leader was unshakable. This is why he couldn't see the flaws in his own strategy. It's why he believed that the West would stay divided, that Ukraine would fold, and that Russia would emerge stronger than ever. In reality, Putin's war in Ukraine has left Russia weaker, isolated, and economically crippled. The carefully crafted image of a resurgent Russia has shattered, and Putin's own legacy is now defined by failure and miscalculation. The war in Ukraine has revealed the hollow nature of Russia's power, an empire built on propaganda, false promises, and a dictator's delusions. So what happens now? Will Putin learn from his mistakes? Probably not. The systems he's built, the FSB, the military, his entire autocratic regime, are designed to feed his ego, not challenge it. Even as Russia's economy teeters on the brink, even as the military suffers catastrophic losses, Putin remains defiant, convinced that he can turn the tide. But history has shown us time and time again that dictators who fall into the trap of believing their own propaganda are doomed to fail. What we're witnessing is the slow, inevitable collapse of Putin's regime. It may not happen today or tomorrow, but the cracks are already showing. The war in Ukraine has exposed the weaknesses of Putin's leadership, and those weaknesses will continue to haunt him. As Russia's economy crumbles and its military falters, Putin's grip on power will weaken, and the question of his legacy will no longer be about how he restored Russia's greatness, but about how he destroyed it. In the end, Putin's greatest mistake wasn't invading Ukraine. It was believing that he could do so without consequence. That mistake has cost Russia dearly, and it will define Putin's legacy for years to come. But what do you think? Which of Putin's mistakes was the most catastrophic? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned for more in-depth analysis on the latest developments in Russia, Ukraine, and the wider world.